Welcome to this week's edition and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we've been putting together for coming up on 10 years from the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Thank you for letting us serve you up some information and some things that food for thought on a weekend morning here across the Commonwealth of Virginia. Our first guest has written a book called License to Work, a national study of the burdens of occupational licensing. And I wanted to bring in Dick Carpenter. He is the Director of Strategic Research at the Institute for Justice, one of our favorite organizations. Happy holiday season, Dick. I hope you've had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you, sir?
I'm well. How are you, Joe?
Excellent. Now, I'm going to tag some things into this, not because of specific connection, and I say that only because every time I speak to anyone who's got any legal connection, they try to correct me. But I'm pointing out the fact that we've had a story about Uber and their hacks, and the FCC and net neutrality. And in both cases, there has been subtext in both of those industries and in those regulations regarding oversight and who's watching the drivers of Uber, who's controlling whose website and what can be put up for sale on the internet. And it all feeds into this idea that I think that we're being herded into a place where, you know, thinking logical people might even be considered voting for greater regulation on licensure. Oh, well, how do I know you're appropriately selling this? Or what kind of business is that on the internet? And so all of these things, I think, fall at least near the umbrella of this license to work idea, that in order to do whatever it is that God has given you a gift to do, you have to get permission from the government first to do it. Is that a fair thing to say about what we see on so many different levels?
Yeah, I think people tend to want to feel like the services they're buying or the goods that they're buying and the people that they're interacting with in a commercial sector, that all of that is going to be error-free, that there are going to be no problems, that they will be exposed to no risk. But the myth is that licensing is somehow going to stop all of that regulation is going to stop all of that. I think it's worth remembering that Bernie Madoff was licensed. And when you see these stories of public school teachers having sex with their students, those individuals are licensed.
Ooh,
you may remember
yes.
that in Georgia, I think it was in Georgia, there was a fellow who owned a funeral home, and he was pitching dead bodies out in the woods behind his business. That guy was licensed.
Mm-hmm.
So licensing doesn't necessarily stop all of these things. So I think that's the myth about licensing.
Is there an implicit sort of government warranty in that? I worry also that if a government gives somebody a license, it just gives somebody to seek damages from yet another place. If so and so, my grandmother was maltreated by a licensed funeral home director, I can also go after the government that gave this guy the license for recompense and sometimes legitimate damages, but not necessarily a legitimate source for those damages.
Yeah, I doubt that they would be able to do so because of some sort of immunity that the government would have, as is typically the case. So that probably seems unlikely. But again, it gives, as you said, it gives that impression.
But that warranty, we also see it in things like USDA stickers on packages of meat that then get recalled because of some sort of bacterial infection. And then you find out that the USDA charges for those stickers and you can buy them and contribute to the right people. And that corruption, though maybe not in the intent in the onset of these licensures, whether it be an endorsement of grade or just giving somebody a license, can be bought for the right price, especially as it becomes a bigger bureaucracy. Is that a fair thing to say, Dick?
Well, it's interesting that you call it a warranty, and it gives certain impressions to potential consumers. But I tend to think, and we at IJ tend to think, that there are other structures, other options that actually can convey even more and better information than any licensing scheme can. So, for instance, you and I and everyone listening, on our phones, we can actually, through Yelp and Home Advisor and Angie's List and all Google reviews and all kinds of review sites, we can actually get more information about service providers than any licensing scheme will ever produce.
This is true.
And so we have this impression that, oh, well, they have this license, and therefore it conveys a certain amount of information or a certain level of quality. That doesn't give you anywhere close to the type of information, real-time information from actual consumers that you can get from all of these sites.
You know, John Adams was once asked about this constitutional republic we were concocting, and he said, you know, it would require us to be moral people. Is this somewhat of a symptom of a society that has created this sort of ambiguity of like, well, it's okay until I get caught mentality, and if I don't get caught, it must have been okay kind of thing, where, you know, lying, cheating, playing fast and loose with, you know, the rules is okay as long as nobody catches you?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the interesting thing is that John Adams made that observation a couple of hundred years ago, and we're still having that same discussion today.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think people are substantively different today than they were at that time. And again, some sort of government stamp of approval is not going to automatically or substantively change that. And I think, as giving in the examples I gave earlier, show that it has not changed it and it will not change it. And certainly, I don't think it has the power to alter people's behavior or modify people's behavior in the same way as reputational risk does. So, for instance, if I own a business and I presumably want to keep doing business, then what I care most about is my reputation. And that reputation is now more than ever on full display for all kinds of other potential consumers to see in ways that we've never had before. So one's reputation is one of the most important things that a business has. Look at big businesses who run away from celebrity scandals.
Oh, well, look at CBS and PBS and Charlie Rose, just as a great example.
Big businesses are very aware of their reputations, and they do all kinds of things to protect that. The same is true with small businesses as well. And if ever there was anything that modified or regulated behavior, that would be it.
Well, let me ask you that, because that does tie sort of into the old net neutrality, who should be overseeing Internet postings. Some of these reputation sites do a very good job, and I think the ones that carry the most gravitas, like an Angie's List, do a very good job of controlling who is posting and you know, making sure that somebody who makes a post is not just a competitor that wants to, you know, damage your number of stars you get because they're trying to compete with you. Angie's List, I think, is one. I believe Home Advisor also has some pretty strict internal controls over that. But it reminds me of the people who say, well, we need to control who's posting what on Facebook pages and Twitter because, you know, who knows who these people are? They could be Russians. And that sort of thing also leads us to this federal or statewide licensure of you know, both, you know, individual businesses and businesses in general, doesn't it, Dick?
Well, we talk about reputational risk and the importance of maintaining a reputation. Even these review sites, they are also concerned about it. The reason that they go through all of these steps to ensure that people who are posting are actually people who have been actual consumers, the reason they go through that is because they too want to protect their reputation as a trusted and reliable source.
Right.
So we as consumers, we look for that as well. So it's funny that even these types of sites, these types of services, want to protect their reputation just as much as anyone else. And certainly I would say they have a greater interest in doing so than any government agency does.
We're visiting with Dick Carpenter this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, Director of Strategic Research at the Institute for Justice, and you can read his report, ij.org/report/license to work. And it's a study of the burdens of occupational licensing. I want to go a different side of this occupational licensing, Zeal. Dick, because I hear it a lot in the progressives that hold offices, especially the progressives that hold office in downtrodden economies. Danville certainly is a great example of it. Martinsville, even areas that would on the surface seem profitable like Charlottesville, where there's a big gap in between those who achieve good incomes and those who don't. They talk about, get in here and we'll get you a license and that will help you get a job. And then you wind up, taking government subsidy to go to a community college or a training center and get a government license. And I'm not sure if that's just to keep you busy for 6 months or a year or however long it takes. But do you see that as sort of a shell game to keep the people who are not achieving economic independence from realizing that the government's the one who's really standing in their way and masquerading more as somebody who's trying to help them get that job license to go out and get work?
Well, here's the interesting thing about the licenses and how they come to be. Most people, I think, have an impression that these licenses exist because some benevolent government representative thinks that, there's a significant threat to public health and safety, and we need to protect consumers, and therefore let's pass a license. That's not how these licenses are created. Instead, members of industry go to the legislature and ask for a license of their own industry. It's people from within the industry who are asking for a license, a fence to be erected around their occupation that keeps competitors out and enables them to artificially inflate prices and wages. So that's how these licenses come to exist.
I love the way you painted it as individual protectionism or occupational protectionism. It's saying, hey, I'm an HVAC mechanic and I don't want somebody else showing up in town. We see this in the medical profession, don't we, Dick, with the certificate of need laws in Virginia, where you have to ask all the other doctors in an area if it's okay if you open a doctor's office.
Yeah, certificate of need is really one of the most pernicious forms of protectionism going, where a new business wants to enter a market, and the government not only sets up this incredibly difficult process to get through just to enter the market, but it gives essentially a veto power to all the existing companies. So it's like if we say to McDonald's, you have the ability to say no to Burger King if they want to open up across the street.
Yep.
That's ridiculous. We would all say that's ridiculous, but that's going on all over the place in the medical industry.
And at the end of the day, I know that you guys are looking at the legal ramifications, but from the consumer, they suffer because all of these protectionists, whether it's in the occupational licensing, as there's restraint in trade in general, the cost of everything goes up. Whether or not government subsidy directly, it's a passive subsidy by saying, listen, you can be the franchisee. It's almost as if we're creating these little mini utilities. You'll be the HVAC guy for this region, the same way we say to Dominion, you're going to be the electric company for this area. Just don't be too egregious with the rates you charge.
Right. So when we create a scarcity, and that's what we're doing when we have this type of regulation, when we create a scarcity, it just stands to reason that what's going to happen is the prices to consumers are going to go up. And so then the government feels like, we have to do something about that. Let's impose some sort of restrictions on how much people can charge, et cetera, et cetera. So the government creates the problem and then has to believe it has to come in and solve the problem rather than letting the market work. And here's an interesting example. So there's a certain hospital in Northern Virginia that I will from time to time hear advertised on the radio by saying, we have the only, I think it was something like a neonatal unit or something like that. We have the only neonatal unit in the region. And I just want to yell at the radio, that's because of the certificate of need law. You have taken
and you keep anyone else from opening one.
Anyone else from providing that service.
Well, and that's the part that really breaks my heart, because they pretend, and this is the fraud that I feel like even the elected officials are complicit in, is they're pretending like they're protecting the consumer when they're really sticking it to us.
Yes, yeah. So they advertise that as some sort of advantage. We're superior to everyone else. That may be so because you've been superior in protecting yourself from competitors.
So what, especially now as we go into an even more divided General Assembly, what is the likelihood that any of this is going to get better before it gets worse, Dick?
Well, the good news is there is momentum. going. And the momentum is, I think, in large part because people are beginning to realize, and when I say people, I mean this is a bipartisan awareness, where people are beginning to recognize some of the dynamics that we're talking about, that these restrictions and these regulations harm consumers, often have little efficacious benefit, and we say harm consumers, but there are other costs associated with these things as well. So it's not just the only cause. It's not like there's only one cause, and that's greater cost to consumers. There are also fewer job opportunities as a result of licensure, and that's one of the rare public policies that does exactly what it's designed to do. It keeps people out. And then it also restricts interstate mobility and migration. It makes it harder to move from one state to another. And then there's an interesting cost that many people haven't really thought about, but that is licensing actually makes it much more difficult for people who have a criminal background to find work. The research on this is crystal clear. Staying out of prison, you've been in prison, you've left prison, the ability to stay out of prison is directly tied to finding meaningful work, but licensure makes it more difficult to find meaningful work because states will often say you cannot get a license if you have a criminal background. So there are real significant economic and social costs associated with licensing, and so finally there's greater bipartisan awareness, and now states are beginning to look at reform options. Even the federal government has had a bill introduced. The FTC has an economic liberty task force. Secretary Acosta has created a team to look at licensing. So there's now growing awareness and momentum toward reform.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up, and I was reminded that when Terry McAuliffe conveyed voting rights back to all of the felons that he felt like were on a list of, and many of them were out of jail. Some of them had gone back to jail or were missing, but they didn't get their all their rights back. This was really just about voting rights. These were not conveyed and full pardons from the governor that would have eliminated those criminal background records that would have tripped that up. And yet we'll talk about recidivism and how do we help with that, and it really smacks even more disingenuous now that you say that.
Yes, and I think it's a cost that many people just don't realize, and it's a pretty significant and an irrational cost as well. Here's the thing. Many states will spend enormous amounts of money to train people who are in prison to learn a trade, barbering, plumbing, HVAC, electrician, et cetera, and then once they get out of prison, they say, well, we've taught you the skill, but you can't get a license to do it, so sorry, you're out of luck. And so the state is spending enormous amounts of money and then working at cross purposes by saying you can't get that work once you finish.
Well, I appreciate your efforts on this, and are there particular members of the General Assembly we should be buttonholing on this as we go forward? Our organization here is very good at putting pressure where pressure needs to be put, both in Democrat or Republican caucuses to see if we can move further. Steve Landis had his the medical bill where the medical associations were now permitted, even though we still have to get certificate of need for the doctors that would be part of them. But where can we apply appropriate pressure to move this forward?
Yeah, I don't have specific names. I think rather a way to think about it is when reform bills are making their way through the process, that the committees to which they are assigned is really a key place for folks to call or write or speak about or send copies of our report to. So when those particular types of bills make it to those committees, those, I think, are the key places to bring attention to and try to bring influence on.
Well, I will suggest to everyone to stay tuned, and we will keep you apprised as those. I know that there are several different committees with good people on them, but they will reconstitute as well once we get into January's General Assembly session. And certainly we will have you back on. Dick Carpenter, Director of Strategic Research at the Institute for Justice. Look up his report, License to Work. Again, it's ij.org/report/license to work. Dick, have a wonderful weekend, and thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
My pleasure, Joe. Thanks for having me.